Without further ado, we'll get on to the subject of tonight's program. We'll be talking about, or rather, these folks will be talking about the book No Ashes in the Fire, which is a very powerful book. And again, it's a memoir, but it's also a work of history. As Darnell explores kind of his coming of age and why he thinks that he is the way he is and why he's grown up the way that he's grown up, we learn about his family's history and how that ties into the larger history of places like Camden, New Jersey, and redlining practices and things that have contributed to urban poverty and things that have instilled racism in different places. So a history of a person becomes a history of a family, becomes a history of everything. And that's probably enough out of me. We can welcome people to the stage who are far more qualified to talk about this story. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Hari Ziyad. They're an artist, writer, and the editor-in-chief of the digital publication RaceBaitR. Their work is informed by their passion for storytelling and wrestling with identity as a Black non-binary child of Muslim and Hindu parents while growing up in Cleveland. Hari primarily creates art engaging with identity, race, gender, and sexuality, allied politics, and the arts. Their work has been featured in Gawker, Out, The Guardian, Huffington Post, Ebony, Mike, Paste Magazine, Afropunk, and just about anywhere else you can think of. Their work is also in the upcoming anthology series, The Future is Black, Afro-Pessimism, Fugitivity, and Radical Hope in Education, among other publications. They also are a script consultant on the untitled Terrell McCraney TV series set to premiere on OWN, the managing editor for Black Youth Project, and an assistant editor for Vinyl Poetry and Prose. They'll be joining the author of No Ashes in the Fire, which is available here in our gift shop if you'd like to pick up a copy, Darnell Moore, who is the former editor-at-large at Cassius and currently the head of strategy and programs for the U.S. for Breakthrough TV. He's also a columnist at logotv.com and newnownnext.com, and a contributor at Mike, where he hosted their widely viewed digital series, The Movement. He writes regularly for Ebony, Advocate, Vice, and Guardian. He's a writer-in-residence at the Center for African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice at Columbia University, has taught at NYU, Rutgers, Fordham, and Vassar, and was trained at Princeton Theological Seminary. In 2016, he was named one of the Root 100, and in 2015, he was named one of Ebony Magazine's Power 100 and Planned Parenthood's 99 Dreamkeepers. He divides his time between Atlanta and right here in Brooklyn. Please welcome them both to the stage.
I hate having my bio read. I was over there like,
it's so long, right?
It's long. Hari, before we start, I have two announcements to make. One, we should acknowledge that Hari is in the middle of finishing their book. Give us the title.
Black Boy Out of Time, a never coming of age story.
Being published by who?
Little A, Amazon Publishing.
So we need to give Hari a round of applause for that.
Yeah, it wasn't added to my bio yet, but...
And also, Hari is engaged, just recently got engaged. And Hari's partner, Timothy, is in the front row right here. So.
Wow, thank you so much, Darnell. It's such an honor to be here with you, especially on James Baldwin's birthday. Right. Such an auspicious occasion, considering you carry so much of his legacy in your work, and I feel like we're in this moment where his legacy is being pushed. Have you seen the trailer for the?
I did.
Barry Jenkins. Have you all seen Bill Street Could Talk? It looks so good.
Yeah. Barry Jenkins is working on
an adaptation of a James Baldwin book. The trailer just dropped today. If you haven't seen it, Regina King is in it. It looks amazing. And yeah, this whole day has just been reminding me of Black, queer, beautiful work and to come, and that's already here. So thank you for being a part of that. This is going to be mostly a conversation, but we can start off by some questions. I know you probably get this first one a lot, but, and for good reason. I think your title is fire, no pun intended. But what was the inspiration for that? And I'll have some other follow-up questions after that. But
Sure. So the title is both literal and metaphorical. It's a reference to an incident that I talk about in the book. and I've been repeating this story, but I want to say that in repeating the story, part of why I wrote about it was because of the way I think it can help us to reframe our ideas about transformation. And so often prisons and jails and punishment and retribution are the first responses to things when people do us harm. But in writing this story, I wanted people to understand what might be some alternative responses to harm doing. So when I was 14, I grew up in Camden, representing Camden everywhere I go. My family's still there. Even while I'm a Bed-Stuy person, like Camden is where my heart is. And I grew up relatively quirky. I was just like a quirky kid, I did not do the things that boys were socialized to do and were told that they were supposed to do, like play sports. And it wasn't that I didn't want to play sports because I didn't like sports. I honestly could not see the balls coming in my direction. Like, I wear glasses, so the football come and I'll just be getting hit in my head, So I'm like, it's not that I don't want to play sports with y'all. Like, I honestly can't see shit. You know what I mean? But what I did do were the things that girls are typically told that they should do, are good at: dance. I sing in glee club. I used to wear clothes. I used to call it church clothes, like tight pants and church shoes and ties. And anyway, the boys used to pick on me all the time. But this one particular time, I was coming home from having picked up my grandmother's 50 peppermints from the store, and I had them in a little brown bag, and her Courier Post newspaper, and some of my neighbors and the boys in my neighborhood surrounded me. And I was used to this type of thing. And that's also what I want to get across in the book, that it sounds like a spectacular act of violence, which was really quite mundane. Mm-hmm. And that's really hard to get across. One, because I didn't want to give the impression that this was somehow spectacular because the people that were doing the harm were black. So I didn't want that to, we always think black people are more homophobic.
Right.
This is America, like, hello. But that said, they surrounded me and they started jumping me. They were physically hitting me. And one of the boys, who I name in the book, OB, takes a gallon of gasoline. It was gasoline that was filled in a milk carton, a milk jug, and emptied it on me. And when I opened my eyes, he was trying to light a match. Wow. And it was, I was a church boy then, so, I would have said it was like the Holy Ghost, but the wind kept taking the flame out. And in that time, my aunt had come and she saved me. I won't tell you what she did, but know that she was young and she was close to the boys in age, so it might have had something to do with her swinging at them. But that being said, so that is a reference to what it meant to survive what could have been a fire. And there was no body to be laid bare, and therefore no ashes because I survived. But it was also a reference to what it means to be black in America, since America has always been the fire that black people have survived through. Mm-hmm. I have a religious background. What comes to mind is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the story of these 3 Hebrew boys who are in a furnace. And they are seen standing in a furnace alive. And a 4th supposedly the angel of God is walking with them. And it's such a reference to me. That's like black people.
Right, yeah.
Like, if no other group that, among others, like, know what it feels like to survive in a fire, which is not to say that we are that strong and that superhuman to always survive. It's a critique of the fire. It's a critique of the systems that try to take us out of here, but it's also saying that we build family. We create life, we find joy, we dance, we make love, we create intimacy, even as the fire flourishes, and it was my way of calling that to attention as well.
Right, that's really powerful, and that story is so poignant, and I know you said that it's not exceptionalized in any way, but this is something that also me and George talk about a lot in writing our own books.
George, by the way, who also has a book coming out as well, soon to be published.
But we talk about these like traumatic moments and how, especially with yours, because it's so related to the title, so that's like the first thing you always have to bring into a space. How do you deal with managing that over and over and over again?
So the good thing is, and I sort of don't say this in public because it turns the book signings into something other than book signings, but I did train as a psychotherapist and received. That don't mean I'm doing therapy. I don't practice. But one of the reasons why I went and got a degree in clinical counseling, particularly focused on youth psychotherapy, was I went to get help. And I went to undo a lot of the traumatic holds on my life, which is to say that work always happens. So I come to the work, and I think this is important to talk about as a writer, as an artist. I do come to the writing process with that background in mind. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about the audience. I'm thinking about the type of empathic space that they need to read a book that may trigger them. I think about this when I'm out talking about these things, and so often I actually wanted to bring along resources for healers when I come to spaces like this, because I know it can be triggering.
I remember the last talk I went to, you pointed out some people doing that work in the audience.
Yeah, because people, they go in when you sign a book, and I'm like, this is a signing, not a session, But that being said, healing is not a destination that we arrive at once and for all. Part of the process was going through my own sort of work with counseling, as on both sides of the table, but the writing of the book was also a cathartic release in so many ways. What I want to say and just note about OB, the person that tried to set me on fire, and I'm always making sure that I repeat this. By the end of the book, I was searching his name online because I wanted to make sure that he wasn't in jail. And I wanted to make sure that he was alive. And I don't know if he is. I couldn't actually find him. And my fear was that he's not here, either free outside of the cages of a jail cell or alive. That was a transcendent moment for me, because somebody tried to set you on fire, you're supposed to hate them. You're supposed to wish that they are not here. You're supposed to want the same thing that they did to you to be happening to them. I should want him to be punished until you recognize, because I know this to be true, because some of my family members have been sent to jail to be punished, to be changed, that jails don't change shit. That cages don't free spirits, they don't free minds, they don't get you from being homo-antagonistic. And all I wanted by the end of the book was for him to be alive and in a space where he himself might be able to understand how he could be different in the world. And I don't know if that happens with him, but that realization only came through the writing process, which allowed me to sort of break open and to really think deeply about that.
That reminds me of how when you're writing about your father, which I wanted to get into a little later, but I think there's a connection. And you talk about how at first you had written about your experiences very differently before he passed, which had happened during the writing process. And you began to look at things at a very different way after that death happened, and you began to give him a little more grace. I don't think you use that language, or maybe you do. But I think that's really, I find a connection between that and your hope for Obi to be alive. But just in general, like, how has the process of writing this book and the process of your father passing, all of these things together, the process of writing through that story, influenced how you've looked at conflicts with Black folks who are in your life right now and changed it?
It's my relationship to my father, his death, my coming to terms with his more expansive humanity has absolutely shifted my understanding about why we need not dispose so easily of each other, of Black people. Just as context, and Hari knows this, I had a really complicated relationship with my dad. It was one of those things where I loved him so much and despised him so much all at the same time. He had me at 15, so I should note that. I say that aloud, and I say it to you because it wasn't until I was writing and I wrote, and my dad had me at 15, that it clicked. And I was like, wait a minute, he was only 15 when I was born. At 15, I could barely pee straight. And I'm like, wait, he was a boy. He didn't finish 8th grade. And writing that down was the first moment where I was like, okay, let me try to walk through or sort of follow the steps of a 15-year-old who has a child with his best friend, really, of childhood, who was 16. And then I kept thinking, I was asking myself questions. Who taught him what he knew? Who taught him what he knew about boyhood? Who taught him what he knew about manhood? Get this, his nicknames were Sweet Daddy. That's what they were calling him when he was a kid. Sugar Daddy, Sweet Daddy, Boo Boo. He was like, we were very opposite, by the way. He the real cool cat, and I was like his little son with big ass glasses on, high socks, like dancing like a girl. So it was and I used to be like, he loved me still, because everybody loved Sweet Daddy. They loved him, and I kept thinking, oh, so as a child, he was taught to believe that a man is to show his power in this relationship through his physical prowess. He was not only taught but rewarded for that. Yeah, and and part of what I wanted to do was sort of begin to unpack and pull back some of those layers and get behind the sort of the surface and try to figure out how he goes from the little boy. I write in a book about him teaching me how to bathe, and we're in a bathtub together naked. And that moment, one, was important for me to capture a black father and his son, very young, 23 and 8, in a bathtub together naked, because so often black male intimacy, in the ways that we come to sort of see it depicted, only ever brings up images of violence in our minds, because violence happens within those spaces too. But when I read this part of the book, when I read that part out in the world, people always they cringe. And they tell me that they believe that they thought that by the end of the story, he was going to sexually harm me, which says so much about the realities of sexual violence, but also the ways we overly determine or read or interpret black men who are interpreted as men, or read as men, or identify as men, as already being hypersexualized. So I wanted to draw this beautiful image of two boys, really, in a tub together, one older, who's a father, teaching his son how to wash himself with these beautiful hands. Right. And then right after that, he's using those same hands to choke my mom. The other thing I'll say is that my mom, when I would talk to her and have her read through the book, I said, how did you forgive him? How did you come to a place where you, not hate him? She was, supportive when we were planning the services for him, and I'm like, you don't seem at all impacted. And she said it's because I had a chance to see not just the monsters that he represented, but I saw the other things that he did in my life too. And she told me two stories. One, when she was almost sexually assaulted when she was a kid, he was a person that got beat up to protect her and slept in her backyard every day to keep the assailant away. She also said that when she didn't eat, because at this point her family was trying to you got a kid, you grown, raise yourself. He was the one that was getting her food, and he would make sure that she eat, and she would repeat these things. And she said to me, it's not that I don't remember or forget what he did, it's that I see a fuller picture. And that, on his deathbed, at his funeral, eulogizing him, I came into contact with a man, a black boy who became a black father, who wasn't only a monster. He did monstrous things, but he also did beautiful things. And then I kept thinking, the reason why it was so easy for me to hold him up as a monster is because it helped me to look at myself as I was the better boy. It helped me to feel like I was the better person, less sexist, less misogynistic, especially because I'm queer. Until I had to look in the mirror, and in the book I write, I am his ellipses. Skin of his skin, bone of his bones, and have the same potential to do harm. And that has influenced my politic with regards to black people.
Wow. And I think that, in so many ways, we know that that's not just your father's story, but that happens to so many black children. Their childhood is distorted, at least in certain ways. And so the process becomes one of not of opening your eyes to be able to see more than just the monsters. And like you said, it's easier not to do that. So how do we push past, and I know that as an activist and organizer, you've had to actually come up with strategies. How do we move past what's easy, especially when it comes to like our engagement with Black folks? And the whole world is giving us all the tools to discard one another. How do you, I should say, push past what's easy?
Well, to push past what's easy isn't easy. I have a lot of people that have said to me, this is like, what are you saying? I should just forgive so quickly? Where is the accountability in that? And what I've been saying is that what I'm talking about in terms of not doing to each other what the systems do to us isn't an act of cheap grace. I'm not talking about cheap grace. Cheap love, the Hallmarkish, Americanish love that lies, if you get what I'm saying. The kind of love that is, or the grace that's extended without a call for accountability and a stopping of the violence, a stopping of the thing that's doing harm, and a reconciled, even if not relationship between a person who's being victimized, but at least a reconciliation of the person with themselves to the point that they can come to a point of transformation. What I'm talking about is transformative justice, restorative justice practices that aren't easy because it doesn't fit the script that we've been given.
Right.
We're told somebody do you wrong, you call the police, send them to jail, they're out of your way. Sometimes, if they do you really wrong, you seek the death penalty. But you know how many times I was the one calling the police when my father was doing some of those actions. But the fact that I had to call so much tells me something now as an adult that wherever he was going, that shit wasn't working. So I'm now imagining in the place of what already exists, if I had another option outside of calling the police, what might have been in place so that one, my mom first could have been safe, and two, he could have been put in a position where he could have been held accountable, came into some understanding around the harm that he was doing, kept away from her if he could not resolve those issues, still not in jail that would have exacerbated the problems that he was facing, and experienced some type of transformative moment. And when you don't have that, when all you have is what we have,
Right.
I write about this all the time. We don't have time to dream of what could have been in this place. I would have loved if there was some type of community circle that when shit started getting hot, I could have just called a number, they would have showed up at my house right away.
Right.
And intervened. So to dream those practices requires us to take time to do so. And I've been traveling around the country over the last few years. I would tell people, what does a Black liberatory loving world look like? And nobody would phrase it. I'm like, tell me. And they would have so much trouble giving me responses because we spent most of our time analyzing the problems.
Right.
I can tell you, to ask me what the problems are. I got you. Ask me how to fix said problems. Not so much. So part of what I think the work is giving people space in collectivities like this to dream together about what, and I mean down to the local level, like to the level of the block. I would have loved it if people, I live in a type of hood where you know what's happening. I would have loved if my neighbors would have got my mom together and say, listen, Diane, we see this is happening, here's what we're gonna do.
So in some way, what you're saying is it's not always, or at least this is what I'm hearing, it's not always that it's just easy, it's also that it's the only option that we think that we have.
Yeah.
And a lot of the work that you're doing is pushing us to imagine other possibilities of what could be.
And I want to be clear that violence is, depending on how one moves through the world, this can sound like a privileged take.
Right.
Here I am, I'm not walking down the street. I can walk from the A train to my house and sort of escape a lot of the violences that femme folk can't. So I want to be clear that this is not some cheap, like, everybody, let's just be willy-nilly forgive all the people. That's not what I'm saying, because I do realize that the extent to which one is harmed and the multiple ways that one is harmed is different, depend on how you're moving in the world, expressing oneself, and are read and interpreted. And therefore, to ask someone to easily, quote unquote, forgive, which is not what I'm doing, or even extend grace, is something that I wouldn't want to push onto somebody. I just offer it as an option.
And model it.
Yep.
I want to go back to the title for a second. The second part is coming of age, black and free in America. We briefly talked about it before. The free part really stuck out to me. A lot of people, I'm sure, will say, like, we're not free. What do you mean by coming of age, black and free?
I was telling Hari that when I was in D.C. at Howard University bookstore, there was this brother sitting at my he was waiting for me too at the table, and the book was sitting up. He's like, "Are you the author?" And I was like, "Oh my God, like, yeah, you know, I'm from the hood. Like, I gotta fight you. Like, what's up?" And he's like, "What you mean free? You black?" And I was like, "You right? You kind of got that right." But what I was explaining to him was. So let me be clear in that I already talked about how America is the fire. I'm very clear about the structural and real material conditions that restrict and constrict Black life. And then in the book I write about as a sort of, not a counter, but another way to think about ideological existential freedom. Is Mumia Abu-Jamal, the political prisoner who I got to hear, who talked to us as college students when I was at Seton Hall. And I remember thinking as I was hearing Mumia talk, Mumia is more free than me, even though Mumia is behind quote unquote material bars. What I meant by that was ideologically, he had been freed in so many ways from the grip of anti-Black racism and from colonial vestiges of and understandings, in ways that me, being on this predominantly white campus, had yet to even achieve. And freedom here, I mean, in terms of freedom to see beyond the gaze that have us hating ourselves, that have us manipulating ourselves into something that we aren't, changing ourselves into lies. When I was able to look in the mirror and see a person, a body looking back with dark skin and big lips and full nose, and look at the eyes of somebody who loved other boys, who was queer, who was moving beyond the cage that was given to him that was called masculinity or heterosexuality. I was like, oh, that's some magic shit. To love the parts of oneself you're taught to hate, to refuse normative standards, to refuse rules, to say, I see your rules, I hear your rules, and I'm saying middle finger to all of that. To be when you're not supposed to be. That's some free shit. Now, I want to be clear that that is not to say that even within the context, one is still not in the fire. Do y'all hear what I'm saying? The fire still rages. But like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you know, you're moving, the fire's still raging. The freedom is the ability to see the fire and to know that it's actually blazing. That, to me, is what I was trying to get at. And in no way trying to offer up some sort of liberalism.
Yeah.
You know, like, oh, I'm free because, you know, I done succeeded.
Right.
Nah.
One of the, this is really related to the way you talk about cages. You talk about them both mental cages and physical cages, our need to get rid of them. And you're saying that in one sense they're different, but they're also very connected. What do you think is the relationship to being able to look in that mirror and see yourself, and prison abolition, or is there a connection?
I think so. You know, I often say that, you know, so many. Well, there's a couple points. There's a way in which we talk about prison abolition now. It sounds sexy, but to engage a practice of prison abolition, which is to say, to be about the work of removing systems of incarceration that weren't set up necessarily to heal us. And not just removing them, but as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says, she's a scholar at CUNY, abolition is also about imagining what needs to be put in the place of the thing that doesn't do us good. Abolition is just not about like, let's get rid of all the prisons and jails and the police, but it's about imagining what goes in its place that could actually heal us. But that said, it's one thing to talk that as a rhetoric, and then to practice it, because to practice it means you really are going to have to make some.
You have to be the community of people that the little boys can call when their father is.
Yeah, and you may not necessarily call out in a culture that it perpetuates may or may not be the first thing that will be the tool that we use, right? But I extend that a bit to say, but there are other cages too, ideological ones, and gender is a cage. For some people, it can be a route for freedom, but for others, it can certainly be a cage. Who told us to be what we are typically identified as? And like, how do we learn these things? And then what must we do to undo them? And I write about the cage of sort of manhood and masculinity and what it took for me to sort of abscond.
There's that. I don't mean to cut you off.
No, please.
So many of the things that you're saying reminds me of the video of the two baseball players sharing this embrace.
The beautiful video.
Yeah.
Do y'all know this video?
Yeah, there's a video of, I don't even know what teams, but it's a baseball player who's just resting his head on the chest of another one while he's just rubbing his head very tenderly. And it went viral and got all different, you can imagine this, they're both black, got all different kinds of responses. But I mean, in some of those responses, I think, to your point, were representative of this cage that you can't even imagine to assumed men, because we don't know their gender, feeling tender enough to just lay a head on. There's nothing sexual in that
it was
embrace.
Beautiful. I mean, intimacy is a theme that I try to. Intimacy and touch is one of the themes that I try to unpack in the book, and I try to offer the reader different sort of moments, images where you see or are reading about two people identifying themselves as boys, engaging one another, but it's not sex, and it isn't queer, because they don't even identify as queer. I tell a story about my friend in high school who, like, he was like the drug dealer on the street, the tough guy, the ladies' man, and he would call home every night to stay over at my house. And when he would stay over, we would sleep in the same bed in the basement, and we would just hold each other every night. What is that? It wasn't sex. Well, it was intimate. And I think that was an important moment because I kept thinking we didn't never define that. I mean, that was one moment where well, that's a different story. But I kept thinking how beautiful that was to be free of those restrictions. Like, we never defined that. It was just like we just laid together every night, and I think we both needed that in our sort of in that point of our adolescence between 15 and 17. And I kept thinking, damn, what would it mean to get back to that place where, as a boy child, the teen coming of age, I didn't have all of these hangups around touch. I wasn't calling it like he must. I wasn't calling my friends on the phone like, well, we laid together. What that mean? Like, is he gay? I wasn't doing any of that. This was just like my friend, and it was beautiful. And what might it have meant if that was lifted up? Like, my family loved him staying over. His family loves him staying with me. It's like we made each other better. But then we have all of these sort of words and these sort of languages, these ideas that are mapped onto us.
Right.
by the outside world that then reshapes how we would have engaged one another. We go out into the real world outside of my basement room, and it's like we back to practicing that boy thing that we do. Oh, what's up, dude? Like, yeah. And I'm like, you wasn't doing that last night. You was laying right on my arm, and it was perfectly fine, right?
Right.
But society had a way of sort of shaping us, reshaping our relationship, and I think that it did us harm in some ways.
Yeah, in so many ways you learn to these cages.
But the baseball players, they don't care. Like, you hear people, like, they sit in there in public, and they're like, he's in between his legs, and he's just rubbing his head. It's a beautiful view.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful view.
I know we're running short of time. I want to ask 2 more questions. One, you just started a new amazing venture in your life. Can you tell us more about that and what you're going to be doing at Breakthrough?
The most. Always. Yeah, so Breakthrough is a global human rights organization based in India and here in the United States that is intersectional feminist, that exists to shift, change the conversations around gender-based violence and all of the conditions that exacerbates that: racism, class, citizenship, quote unquote, and what must be done to end that using media, tech, digital technologies, and also popular culture, which is a sort of melding of all of my worlds. So I'm there as a head of strategy and programs for the U.S. I'm really excited about it. I'm an artist, so I really don't like that office life, but this is a job that wakes me up in the morning, which is kind of cool. So follow our work, and I look forward to working with a team of really, and I say younger not because I'm an ageist, but they have, like, this is a team that's hungry. I mean, I've never, like, they are using gaming. They're like, I have a young black woman who's a gamer. I was like, she's create games right in front of my face. I was like, oh shit, like, this is real. So this is the type of thing that we're going to be doing. I'm excited about it.
That's so dope. Congrats again on that. Actually, I lied. I have 2 more after that.
This is why you can't let friends interview you. They know.
Like, now you got to tell me more. No, but one of the things that I always wanted to talk to you about, what I always want to talk about in general, is you talk a lot about how when you were writing this, you had in mind a queer 16-year-old black kid. That was the audience. And obviously, much of the literary world isn't that. So people who are reviewing your books, people in these rooms even. How do you deal with having to legitimize your work so often, not to the people that you are talking to?
That's such a... So I'll tell a few stories. So when I was having the draft of the sort of page proofs that were being edited and had to be reviewed by our publisher's lawyer, she called me on the phone. I told you this. And she's a white woman from Texas. I know, I'm being very stereotypical, right? And, and I was like, okay, she's a white woman from Texas. And I had all these ideas about who this white woman was. And she got on the phone and she said, I just want you to know I read your book. And I had a deep breath, like, oh Lord, here she goes. And she's like, I was so moved. And I was like, what? You were? She's like, no, like, I've resonated with so many of my stories were in the book. And I was like, what? What you mean? Like, you're a white woman from Texas. And what we talked about was the power of art and narrative if you care enough about your words, the power of specificity, and not always relying on a universal as a sort of entry point for the telling of stories. But the reason why, for example, Moonlight did so well because it was very specific. It was very specific. And in specificity, in the particularity of one's lived experiences, of one's life world, you actually can find your way. Art opens up in that way. The other thing is more the sort of technical thing with publishing. I had a hard conversation with my publishing team when we first were talking about the book, and I had someone in the room ask me when I was describing what the book would be, well, how is this going to be different than, you start listing all the black men's books you can find. Oh, Lord. I mean, name a black male writer at a contemporary time. And I was like, and I said, do you ask your white male authors when they're sitting across from you to differentiate their books from their white male counterparts? And I know you don't, because you got a lot of them on the shelf.
Right.
All these white books.
I reject it from a couple places, comparing them to straight men's work. And I was like, this is, just because they were black.
Yeah, and I had to.
You have this one.
I spent some time, and I was like, I love Ziyad Jones. Ziyad Jones is a friend of mine. Ziyad is from the South. I'm from Camden, New Jersey.
Right.
That's one difference. And I started doing that. And the team, I shouldn't have known. The team around this person was so upset that after I left, they had a conversation, and they vowed that this would never happen again to another author.
Well.
That's it. It probably did happen to another author. But I do think the labor that it takes for black folk, black queer and gender nonconforming and trans folk, black folk who are interested in writing stories that are not necessarily so vast and so universal. They're not diversity projects. You understand what I'm saying? You do have to really hold your hand to the fire and say, this is the vision of the book that I have. And this is the book that I feel the spirit who is giving me to write. And if that means it doesn't fit within the scope of what you want, I need to go somewhere else. Not all of us, are in a position to make those type of moves. But I always say to artists, if you can, you hold firm. And I told them, this is what I want to write. This is the person I imagine writing to. And that's that.
Right.
And I believe that in honoring that vision, I feel good that I did the project justice.
Right. I always have to remind myself how I got in those doors in the first place was by writing to a specific audience. I'm here for a reason. And if this isn't the right door, at least I know I can enter it.
Absolutely.
But that's a constant reminder, especially as, the stakes get higher.
And even now in the review, as reviews come in, I'm always, the book is different in terms of its form. It is it's metaphor meets social history, which is a very different sort of take. It isn't linear, and it's a sort of linear through line, but it also is secular in so many ways. It's thematic. So I was really nervous about form. I was nervous about, it being specific to this sort of family growing up in Camden. Nobody talks about Camden, which is why I talked about Camden. It's my city. We're going to talk about my city. So as reviews come out, I'm always oh, what are they going to say? But I've become less concerned about that. I got a message, I'm going to read you all, from a rising senior who found me on Instagram and said, high schooler. Hi, my name is Damien. I'm a rising senior in Elizabeth, New Jersey. I also am the president and member of my school's speech and debate team. For so many reasons, I was so absolutely moved by your book and story. One of the reasons being how close you grew up to me. I felt inspired to share your story, so I actually like to adapt it in this upcoming season in dramatic interpretation. He goes on and on. But I get stuff like this. Y'all, I cried, right? Oh my God. But I wrote that for this little black boy.
Right.
I wrote it for the person that sent me a 20-page letter at my house.
Wow.
I wrote it for, all of the kids. I really did. So for artists, I say, stay committed to that vision, because it will guide you when a bad review comes. It will guide you when that person doesn't review your book. It will guide you when you're not making lists or if somebody's not talking about it, because as long as I keep getting messages like that, as long as I got somebody, a 17-year-old traveling from Jersey City to Brooklyn Museum, who have read the book and saying, I'm going off to my college campus so I can do this, is why we write. Our words can actually be a lifeline, and that is a thing that can be forgotten in an industry that privileges all this other shit, these accoutrements. This is the thing I wrote the book for.
Right.
And I have to remind myself that. So writers in the room, we have to keep that at the heart of our work. And I think that will keep us grounded, and it will keep the work moving forward. That's why we're able to talk about James Baldwin, because I think James Baldwin knew what his job was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have to know what ours is.
Right, I needed that. The last thing I want to ask before we open the questions up to the audience, I saw Dana Smith actually had posted, I think it was Dana, on Twitter, and I was like, if I ever am moderating a talk, I'm always going to ask this question. But what question do you wish that you get about this book when you're out talking that you don't get?
So this is like event number 35. I think I got every question so far. That's a good question.
And if it's not anything, we can open it.
No, it's good though. So Jason Reynolds, who is a young adult writer that I implore everybody to read, came to my talk in Atlanta, and he said the one thing about Black writers who particularly are interested in writing memoirs or telling life narrative through memoir, that also are true stories, are what Sarah Schulman calls difficult stories. I rather call them difficult stories. One, because it takes some level of care to talk about hardship, joy, life's realities, traumas, and victories in an artful way. Yeah? And he said so many times the writer gets asked questions about how they're feeling, specific questions about the story, and less about form, and less about the art. What I want to know, the question I would ask is, what was sort of like the critical what's sort of the hard elements in terms of, are necessary elements in terms of memoir writing? That sounds so simple, right? Never been asked. People like, well, what happened? Did you beat OB up after he tried to? I'm like, no, I didn't beat him up. He could fight real good. I was not trying to fight him. That's the real truth. But if I were to respond to that question, one of the things that I did pick up from Coates in an interview that he gave with regard to memoir, his simple words was, don't fucking lie. And I don't know if you know how hard it is to tell the truth. And not just the truth about your environment, but the truth about oneself. And often in memoir, it can be easy to be the hero or the victim. It's very hard to do the type of self-reflexive work where you have to analyze your own complexities and find out that you have been both, and oppressor and oppressed. That was difficult. And trying to balance how to tell the truth in such a way that doesn't overly... I'm writing about Camden, for example. I could have easily said, Camden was, I grew up around dilapidated homes. I saw crack. And that can easily be sort of trauma porn. But how then do you write about the realities of one's lived experiences with the type of care and attention that allows you to write one beautifully, but also in such a way that I need to tell the story about me living in one of those houses along dilapidated homes, but guess what was happening inside the home? My family was getting their entire life. They were loving one another. Even in a 3-bedroom house. Right. And the nuance that it takes to do that is not easy shit. It's hard work. Memoir is not just telling one story. It is artful way of telling it's art. the form that one has to sort of engage, the figuring out the form, figuring out what stories one are going to tell that fits an overarching sort of narrative arc. It is a narrative arc that you have to develop. Like, those are all elements that are also part of this process, and not just sitting down at a computer saying, let me tell you my life from A to Z. It's hard. The ethics of telling someone's story, yours and someone else's, that it implicates. So those are some of the elements that, and I'll end by saying too, I told my editor, any black writer out here know that's writing a difficult book. I'm like, publishing houses should be coming with, like, as part of the contract, therapists. Because writing this shit by yourself was no joke, okay?
Yes, I definitely needed that. But yeah, now I want to open it up to the audience. If anyone has questions, someone should be along with the mic to have you ask them.
Thank you both for that amazing conversation. It was really caring, and I just feel like soothed and like kind of bathed. Darnell, I have a question about I don't know how to phrase it. I'm thinking about that story you told about your mother, and my name is also Diane. So when you said that, I was like, got a little shook. But I'm wondering, like, how your sort of practices of care and attention and grace, how they've sort of, and especially like in the way you sort of describe how you kind of met that with your father, how they've kind of opened up to your understandings and interactions and relationships with women, and Black women in particular, because I'm thinking it's Jimmy's birthday, and I'm thinking about that conversation he has with Audre Lorde when she talks about Black women being the blank. And while I always love people sort of arriving at, especially marginalized people arriving at love for themselves and love for people who look like themselves, Black women always get lost in that somehow. So
I appreciate that. My mother is a central character, and part of the reason why I made it so is because so often Black writers who are men identified are often asked to write about the Black experience, and the reason why people listen is because it's so organized around, like, Black men, heterosexual men, right? And I wanted to give a sort of vantage point of a Black experience, a particular one, in a particular place and time, through the vantage point of this 16-year-old girl. That said, my relationship, I also am pretty honest in the book about my confrontations, or at least the ways in which I employed sexism, my coming to terms with my own misogynistic ways. And so much of that was because of my being in a relationship with Black women and girls who, unfortunately, in many of those moments, who had to do the labor of helping me to see that. I often say women and girls shouldn't have to do the work of telling us what not to do to them to harm them. And so often that's what happens, and then we stop, we get better, and then we say we're feminist, and then we get people clapping like this. But we don't deserve claps. With my mom, I will say that one of the things I wish I had done a better job at is naming that I sort of describe her as this superstar of a parent, not without flaws. But I also wish I had named that too is a choice that she made. I wish I would have named it. She didn't have to be the superstar parent. She didn't have to take on the labor of taking care of me and her partner. Part of what I think freedom means is for her to have had a decision that she didn't necessarily have. She wasn't allowed. And the my inability to name that is also still a part of my processing the sort of patriarchal understanding, right, of womanhood. I will say, though, so when I talk about my relationship to some of my women friends, it's one in particular who's like my best friend of, I'm gonna date myself, and I got gray hair in my beard, it's like 30 years. And I sent her a portion of the book just so that she could read it and so that we can have conversation and talk through those issues. I will say that I came to these understandings not because of Black women, some who name themselves as feminists and some who did not, are the reason I understand. Like I am able to write this book and have an understanding of the world, not just sexism, but an understanding of the world and Blackness. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the questions, but yeah, in the book I try my best to wrestle with that question. And I also try to use my wrestling with the question as an avenue for conversation between myself and a lot of the women and girls who are in my life. Mm-hmm.
My question is on form, story, and character development. You talk about your book is nonlinear in ways and circuitous. When you think about the vignettes that you chose, the stories, and how you prioritize them, can you walk us through
The process?
the process?
You want me to be stressed? You want us to be out here? Okay, so the book that is here is not the book that I imagined writing. I did not want to write a memoir, I should say that. One, because I just thought it was grandiose. And I was like, I ain't do shit. Like, what am I writing a memoir for? You know, you often get like, it was a misreading of the form. So many times you feel like memoirs are to be written by like people who did something. So I didn't want to write it. And I also wasn't ready to put everything on the page yet. Like, you have to be there. But what I knew I wanted to do, so I have a music background. I sing, so I was really interested in having a type of sort of musicality in the book. I grew up in the church, so I sang gospel. So I kept thinking, if this were like rhythmic, if I were to read this out loud, what would I want to hear? So I kept thinking about themes, like sort of thematic lines or verses, using musical sort of terminology that would frame every chapter. And I wrote down words. I can't remember so I wrote down these words, these ideas that I wanted to capture: passage, ripples, magic, touch, run, unbecoming, return, lessons. And I would write those down, and I would think, what life stories speak to the theme that I'm trying to get at? In Passage, that was about travel in a variety of different ways. My family's migration from the South to Camden, New Jersey, so I'm like, oh, well, what do I need to do to tell the story about migration? It's my great-grandmother's story. Her coming from Virginia to Pennsylvania and then New Jersey, where she eventually loses her home. Which is also then a story not just about my grandmother, but a story about Black people, race, real estate in America. See what I'm doing here? So it was this type of layering that happened. And as I'm talking about Passage, I'm thinking, oh, literally, what does it mean to move through your city? And if I'm moving through the city and I'm taking you through neighborhoods so you can get a sense of what they were, and if you understand that some of these neighborhoods had projects and some of these neighbors were Black and some were Latinx, I then think, well, what history or sort of social context do I need to give the reader to understand how those things came to be? So that was sort of, I'm giving you an example of my layering process. For Ripples, it opens with a story of my dad bathing me in a bathtub. Water was a central element. It follows with a story of my dad teaching me how to swim the wrong way by taking me to the middle of the pool and dropping me. like, this motherfucker. I'm sorry. There you go. But it wasn't just about the sort of water as metaphor, but also the ripples that occurred in our intimate lives. The ripples that occurred that was shaping his relationship to my mom, my relationship to him, their relationship to me. And I don't know, is this making sense? Mm-hmm. So then as I'm mapping these stories, I'm like, well, who are the central characters? And what would the reader need to know about them? And not only about them, but the world in which they came to be. So when I'm talking about my 15-year-old dad and 16-year-old mom, it's important that I let them know that they had me in the Reagan era. It's important to name, if I say my mom was 16, that you need to know that she had me amid Ronald Reagan talking about the welfare queen. And if I bring up the welfare queen, then you need to know what that meant under this sort of neoliberal moment. And this is why the book became something other than just like a personal narrative. And it was this sort of movement between all of these different layers as I would go on. And I was like, I don't know if people are going to get this. I hope they do. But that's sort of that's how I wrote it. Mm-hmm. So. And thank you for that. I've never been asked that question before, so thank you for that.
Hello, my name is John, and I want to thank you so much for a really very well-written book. I used your, not books on tape, but the audio, because I can listen to it on the subway and when I'm traveling. Well, I have two questions. The first question is, why did you choose to do an audio book in addition to just the regular book? And then the second question is, are you still involved with the Summer Athletes program that you were a couple of years ago?
Sure. So why did we do an audiobook? Well, it was part of our publishing contract. I wouldn't give you a deep answer, but that's something they gave me. I chose to record it and not have a voice act like somebody else do it because I wanted. There's a particular musicality that I aimed for when writing it. So when I was writing, I would stop after every other page and read aloud what I wrote because I needed to hear how it flowed. And actually, when I tell readers, like, I really would like, if you can, read it aloud. And I knew what that rhythm was, so I wanted to be able to capture that. And I'll say, it's like, I'm from a very particular place. You can hear my word, like, we talk in a very particular way, you know? We say Thursday instead of Thursday. And I wanted to capture that too. And on a very basic level, I kept thinking, I want my nieces and my nephews to go into a library one day and be able to hear their uncle narrating the life of their family. As simple as that. I needed them to go and say, my black uncle, my black queer uncle. Those are his words. And he's saying them. The program that John is talking about is You Belong, a program that Wade Davis and I had started several years ago, where Wade is a former NFL player. We would bring kids to a summer camp, LGBT young people, and give them access to professional athletes. We did an NFL-esque camp and an NBA camp. We did that over two summers with our own funds. So to answer the question, it was very expensive. And we couldn't afford it anymore. But youth is sort of my passion, and I've been working with youth for over 2 decades. And if almost everything I do comes back to black young people and me wanting to create tools for them, which is why I wrote the book.
Any other questions? I think that's
Cool. And I think we'll sign books, yeah?
Absolutely.
Oh, cool.
If there are no
Thank
more
you so
questions, then I
much.
just want to one more thank. Oh wait, I think we got one more. Y'all okay with one more question?
Oh, you do? Y'all saw me with the run.
Sorry. Could you read a little bit more
Sure.
than those words that you shared?
Okay. And yes. And Hari, thank you for this conversation. I was so tired today. I was like, I don't know how I'm gonna make it. It's Mercury retrograde. This is a horrible, horrible day. And then I walked in and all of you lovely people were here. So thank you so much for being here, really. There were many nights I tried to skip bath time during my childhood. Even if my 7-year-old body smelled like outside. As my mom would say, I would leap into my bed without worry, smelling like a mix of grass, hot air, sweat, grime, and good times. The bathtub in our small 2-bedroom apartment felt too confining. And the way the water became sludge after I washed away the residue on my body left from hours of play repulsed me. I would move to the farthest end of any corner in the tub to avoid being touched by the once fresh water made dirty after washing. At some point, though, my dad had decided he had had enough of my resistance. My dad loved the water. He swam with the grace of a bottlenose dolphin. When he went fishing, there was something about him that seemed to attract fish every time he released his pole. His brothers and sisters would tell me later that water was the element in which my father felt most disarmed and whole. One evening after dinner, my father called me into the bathroom. As I walked closer, I could hear the water hitting the bathtub floor with force. The door was slightly ajar as he stood in the tub lathering a washcloth with ivory soap. Because black people love ivory soap. Open the door. What you standing there for, he asked. I walked into the bathroom with as much annoyance as I did whenever I needed to wash. I'm about to teach you how to wash yourself properly. You can't be walking around here stinking. You're getting older and your body is changing, he said, and he prepared the wash rag and soap as if we were about to begin a legitimate class in proper cleanliness. I stepped cautiously into the steamy bath water. It was the first time I stood in the presence of my father when he was naked, which actually made me forget about how much I hated washing. It was mystifying to stand in a bathtub bare before the man who often veiled his deepest emotions and used the force of his physical power to dominate the spaces he moved through. I stared at him as he stood uncovered, more vulnerable and more self-possessed than I had ever seen him. He was 23 years old at the time, younger than I am now, but he was a father raising children. Get all the way in the water. Stop being scared. You gotta learn to clean your whole body, especially behind your ears and under your balls. He instructed me firmly, but with care and amusement, as we squeezed our bodies into the tub. When we sat down, he moved his hand over mine. Together, we grabbed the soapy wash rag and moved it across my neck, behind my ears, along my arms, and across my chest. My father gently washed my back as he instructed me on how best to clean the parts that smell the worst when boys play outside all day. My fear of the bath dissipated more and more after each repetition of calm instruction offered amidst safety, in the presence of my father, who in other instances used the same hands to do damage. There was a lesson to be learned in the water. Bathing correctly was one lesson, but I also learned how tenderness and violence, care and harm are strange bedfellows. They can coexist in our complex webs of human connection, the bad always canceling out the good until the good that we are able to express smudges away the traces of evil even the best of us are prone to meet out. Looking back, I no longer see a young black father who was the totality of recklessness and lovelessness. I see a human being, a young black man struggling to transform what he otherwise used as weapons into instruments of care. His hands, his strong and soft hands, were the source of contradictions in my youthful mind. His hands, his human and fragile hands used gently and violently, now symbolize the complexity I too carry within and negotiate as an adult. In the water, we received instruction. I'll read the end paragraph for you. I buried a man who was stuck. He was forever attempting to break away from the world of the black boy who didn't finish grade 8, the one who had a kid at 15, a boy who was pulled in by the lure of the streets, a teen who would later beat the girl he got beat up for protecting, a black man frozen in time. He was a black man who swung back when love sometimes showed up in the form of an embrace. We are the same. Like my father and so many other black men, some of us don't really ask for what we want because to ask for love is to ask for what has been denied us so long. How many of us want what we have been told we cannot or are not allowed to have? Interpersonal and structural forces shape the ways we give and receive love, as well as the violence we men sometimes inflict upon our partners. I am not sure if that was his struggle. I know it is mine, largely because of his absence, which is a truth I believe had weighed him down. The last words I spoke over his unconscious body as he rested on a hospital bed, surrounded by the kids he had left long before, were simple. Fly. I know you are heavy. We forgive you. Whatever weights you have been carrying, let them go. Fly. I only told him what I learned to do in his absence. I want to be sure that we look out for George's book. George Johnson, say your book out loud, the title.
All boys aren't blue.
Say it again.
All boys aren't blue.
All Boys Aren't Blue. Please look out for George's book. And Harry, tell your book again, please.
Black Boy Out of Time.
Black Boy Out of Time. So let's support these writers, please.